Welcome back to He's a Giant, a pod about all things Giants football, a pod about all things college football. I am your host, Sal. I am dead inside, and I'm here with my co-host Monty, who is raging. And with my internal death and Monty's raging, we bring you a special edition, a special episode fueled by Monty's anger.
Yep.
So I hope you guys enjoy it. But I'm going to let Monty introduce this because this is his brainchild, and I love it.
Yeah. I mean, look, this is something I started messaging Sal about last week, and it's something I wanted to do. But obviously, this week, I felt really emphasized what the change we need in this organization and makes it more and more important because now the Giants out of position to pick their top quarterback. They are likely entering a head coaching search without a clear answer at a quarterback while forcing a GM on the next head coach. So, two things that are not going to be attractive. And then, very well be in a position where we've made it very clear we like Shador Sanders. We've made it very clear we need a quarterback. And we're in such bad leverage. And with a GM that's potentially going to be desperate, that this thing's going to be bad. And we'll talk about all that. But really, where I wanted to start out, because this was the main point, was I wanted to start with the nepotism of the New York Giants ownership. And it's something that ownership has pushed back on. It's something that they pushed back on. Last time we had at least some sort of house cleaning when we moved on from Joe Judge and Dave Gettleman, and Dan Duggan wrote that great article, and we pulled lots of the stuff from that. We pulled some stuff from Ty Dunn's the autopsy, and I can put all that in the description here, so you guys some great reading material there, and we're gonna reference a lot of stuff from that. But the Giants have a clear nepotism problem, and the issue is that John Mara is choosing to ignore that problem exists. He just refuses to accept that he has people in charge who have helped lead to the failures of this once great organization. What once was called the model franchise, the New York Giants, and has led us down to being one of those disastrous franchises in the NFL. We are an embarrassment. We have one of the least winning franchises, and the only thing that has lucked out for John Mara is that the other team that's an embarrassment is the New York Jets, because he would be losing all his fans to the New York Jets right now if they were a successful franchise. So he lucked out there. But this needs to be fixed. And, that starts by accepting that the way the Giants do things is an issue. And they've started to accept that last time around. They made some changes, but it's not big enough, man. You look at number one here, and we'll go into all of it, but I think the number one thing you look at is you look at who's the director of player personnel for the New York Giants, and that's Tim McDonald. Tim McDonald is John Mara's nephew. Tim McDonald has been working with the Giants for, I believe it was 14 years now. He was given the job of director of player personnel 12 years in. I did a little study last year because I was interested. It was about this time last year, and I was seeing about where directors of player personnel are and where they rank with their experience in the NFL. Tim McDonald was the second least experienced director of player personnel in all of football, and they want to tell me there isn't a nepotism problem. 12 years in the NFL was the second least, only behind the 49ers director of player personnel, and their front office has been ravaged. Everybody's taken from the 49ers, and they had no choice but to continue to promote and promote and promote from within. Tim McDonald got this position, and I'm not saying that Tim McDonald is a bad scout or anything like that, but I'm saying he's been part of bad teams, and he's been continuing to rise every single time there's a firing, and there's one reason. It's the connection he has to ownership. He is an owner, and that's an issue. And one thing that came away from me, Sal, I'm gonna hand this off to you because I want to hear some of your thoughts on this. But the one thing that still stood out to me when I was reading these articles was something from Dan Duggan's article, and that was when Chris Mara was originally doing this. For the record, had, I think it was 14 years. Was it 14 years? Yeah, 14 years as just a scout. And he wanted a promotion. He wanted to be the director of player personnel, the job that Tim McDonald has right now. The great George Young told him he can't go into that role because ownership cannot be fired, and somebody who cannot be fired cannot lead now. That is what he told the Maras back then. That's what he told Chris Mara, and blocked his ownership. And then they eventually gave Chris Mara that promotion after George Young was out of the picture, and quickly, even before Chris Mara requested that promotion, they gave it to Tim McDonald. It is completely going against the person who turned around their franchise, who heeded the advice: do not put ownership in the head of player personnel.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me start by, I want to rewind a little bit. I mean, we've talked about this since yesterday. Um, this organization is the most frustrating organization to root for. And I'm a Mets fan. It says a lot for me to say that this is the most hideous experience as a sports fan I could imagine. I'm a Mets, Knicks, Rangers, Giants fan. And the Giants, even though they've won the most titles, are the most frustrating organization to root for. The win loss the other day, they're going nowhere fast. And I think part of the reason all of us felt like that sense of anger and hopelessness is really directly tied to what we're talking about today. Because deep down, every one of us knows that no matter what they do, this group of owners is going to fuck it up. One way or another, they are going to fuck this up. They're either going to hire the wrong person, or they're going to make the wrong decision when it comes to personnel management. They're going to push to have players play when the season is dead, but not put the cattle prod up their ass when the season's alive. This is an ownership down issue. I have been resistant to this idea this year that there's no chance that John Mara can get this right. Because I said they tried to, they got it wrong with Joe Shane, but they got it wrong while trying to get it right. But that's really not the truth. There's a lot more to it. And I think that the problems are a lot deeper. So, I mean, so I think we should just get into, you know, where we are. And I think a history of the Giants, I know most of you guys already know it, but a very brief history. The grandfather of John Mara, Tim Mara, purchased the Giants for $500 in 1925. $500. They have owned it since then and have done literally nothing else with their lives except be part of the Giants organization. After the disaster in 1978, where the plane flew overhead after 15 years of being awful, and eventually what ended up happening was the split between Wellington Mara and his brother Tim Mara, I believe, was pretty severe. After they won their second Super Bowl in 1990, Tim Mara, I think, just got fed up with dealing with Wellington and decided to sell his half of the team, his 50% share of the team, to Bob Tisch, who at the time, they're the head of the Lowe's group, for those of you who know, like the hotels, media companies. They had a major share in CBS at the time. Wellington dies in 2005, I want to say, or 2004. A few months later, Bob Tisch dies, and their sons inherit the Giants. Steve Tisch is a TV. He's like a movie playwright. He's out there in Hollywood doing Hollywood things. We've joked about what he actually does. Who he actually does while he's high, drunk, whatever. Um, he's like Hunter Biden in NFL owner form. But um, and John Mara just lives here. He just does nothing but do this, right? Who is John Mara? He's the oldest son of Wellington Mara. He went to law school. I believe he went to Fordham Law. And he worked for a while as an employment attorney, and he went from that, like literally a few years as an associate in a law firm to general counsel of the Giants in 1991. I mean, general counsel of an organization that is now worth, in upwards of $10 billion. He got that at 1990, 1991, I guess. Like literally, like a few years as an associate, boom, you're general counsel of the Giants. His brother, like you mentioned, had the scouting period and then tried to become GM, got blocked, and became senior
Hmm.
director of player personnel. And his nephew, his sister, their oldest daughter of Wellington Manor, um, John's sister, her son Tim McDonald, what same thing, silver spoon, by all accounts a nice guy, but a silver spoon, lands a job as initially a scout where he gets sent to be an offensive, uh, what was the term they used? Like some sort, like an analyst or an assistant with Charlie Weiss. So they call in their favors at Notre
Hmm.
Dame, and they send him off to Charlie Weiss, and he spends a few years there. And after a few years of Charlie Weiss, literally doing shit like picking up Charlie Weiss's kids from school, and really menial kind of work, he kind of does some scouting, and he gets to the director of personnel, which I think meant that he started to help in the recruitment process.
Yeah.
And he survived Charlie Weiss, and he stayed there when Brian Kelly, I don't know if our buddy one T is here, but he's there during this period. Now, for those who follow Notre Dame football, I know K-Mac is in here and a few others. These are the dark years of Notre Dame. these are dark, dark years where they're not recruiting well, and Brian Kelly kills a kid. That's a whole other story. But he goes from that just directly, boom, to like giant scout, and then fires up the food chain all the way up to, where is he now? Senior director of player personnel, something like that. I forgot his
He's
exact
he's the
title.
director of player personnel right now, and seemingly feels like Joe Shane's other assistant GM is how it feels whenever you see him with Joe Shane wherever he goes.
Right. So that, I mean, I I repeated some of the stuff you said, but I want people to understand, like, these are the players, right? These are the players, and this is how they got there. Grandpa bought the Giants for 500 bucks in 1925, and they've just hung on for dear life. Hung on for dear life this entire time. This is all they do. They have no other industry. They don't have any other ventures that are major. This family does nothing but the Giants. That's all they do, and so they're very protective of their inner circle and their power structure. Even though 50% of the team is now owned by a whole different family.
Yep.
But that's the background of what's going on, right? Let's talk about the we've had this crisis moment before. Post 2021, when Joe Judge had his crash out, even before Joe Judge, like literally from the day that they fired Jerry Reese after the Geno Smith start, when they benched Eli Manning, they started a cascade of events where essentially they took over. And I think we need to dissect some of the stuff that happened. They took over and they went and got their guy. They interviewed 4 people for the job of GM.
Hmm.
4 for the Giants GM job. 4. Who are the 4? Dave Gettleman, that fat loser who had been here forever, right? In his flip flops and his like size 90 waist like shorts walking around. Kevin Abrams, who has been like their cap guy since God knows when. Mark Ross, another internal guy, and freaking Louis Riddick.
John Dorsey, I think, got one too.
Maybe I forget it, but it was literally like this
Regardless, but
tiny inner circle. Dave Gettleman had just been fired as GM of the Carolina Panthers, and when he left, every player on the Panthers couldn't wait to kick him out and tell the world how awful this jackass was. Yet he was the guy that the Giants honed in on, said he's our guy. Okay,
and
well, let me finish this. I want to get into the details, but what did he do? He comes in. We talk about scouting. Why is the team so shitty? We talk about Joe Shane can't draft. The Giants can't draft. It doesn't matter who the GM is. One of the most eye-opening things you read about is how this this lazy fat bastard changed the way the scouting operations of the Giants ran. Because prior to Dave Gettleman, the nepotism GM, that's where the nepotism began, by the way. Prior to Dave Gettleman, there was a system in place for scouting, especially for offensive linemen, which before Dave Gettleman was a strength of this team, and really towards the mid years of towards the end of Reese, it was not good, but there was a system in place, a very old tried and true system a lot of teams use in terms of grading offensive linemen. Things like if they have ideal size, strength, and speed, they got an I grade. If they had great speed, but they were a little undersized, they got, I think, a G grade. Like it was a very simplistic system, but it worked, right? To understand the kind of players you're getting. He comes in, tears it up, tells their entire scouting department that has been doing this for 30 years and generally doing a pretty good job. He tears it up and tells them, no, I'm the smartest guy in the room. You're going to forget everything you've learned, and I'm going to implement my own weird system, and you're all going to use it and make it work. And it's been downhill ever since. Now, we thought that Joe Shane would have done something different. I don't know if he has, but that's literally the inflection point. When the Giants ownership, when the Mara stepped in and said, we're going to change the course of things and bring in our guy, our nepotism hire a GM, and he's going to change everything. And here we are. So, I mean, I know that was a little long winded, but I want people to understand the background here.
Yep. And I want to say, you mentioned those candidates that you interviewed. Know what all those candidates have in common? It was
What?
internal,
Hmm.
and it was guys who have already been let go because they made this move before the season was even like before these other GMs even became open for interview. They wanted to hire Dave Gettleman so fast that they didn't even get the opportunity to interview GM candidates or on other teams because they didn't get the opportunity to get to that stage yet. They completely skipped out on it because they wanted to hire this guy. And was a total like even if Dave Gettleman was a good candidate, which he clearly wasn't. He's clearly one of the worst, well, like not equipped at all to be a GM that we've seen. But he was also a continuous of what we were trying to move on from with Jerry Reese. Like things got bad. We were demanding change. That wasn't change. This is what they keep doing. They're just putting new faces in front of this change instead of actually changing anything. And that's to one of this loyalty that they show. It's this insane loyalty to the people where they can't fire people. They like the most firing we've ever seen when Joe Shane came in. And we still like Kevin Abrams is just his titles changed. Like I'm not saying like I don't want to like call for like whatever. He's out of football operator, but it just it's like speaks to how these guys operate. They won't fire people. The loyalty just goes way too far for people who don't deserve this loyalty. I mean, you look at what changes happened when we started going downhill. You go back. Let's trace it back. So 2011 season, 2012 year, we won our last Super Bowl. And then from then on, it's gone downhill. What happened in 2011? What happened in 2011 was Chris Mara was promoted to director of player personnel. The same position that George Young told Chris Mara that he shouldn't ever be put into because you can't fire ownership. The same position that he warned John Mara's father about. John still promoted him to the position. Since then, things have gone downhill. What happened in 2013? Just 2 years later, again when things really went bad. This is when Tim McDonald was promoted as or hired back as a scout. And again, I'm not here to say that like, look, there's things that Chris Mara was like associated with. Like he's got credit for finding Ahmad Bradshaw. Good for him. Like that was a big thing. There's credit where people really seem to do respect Tim McDonald in that building, and it doesn't seem like he's somebody who's necessarily trying to like push his ownership onto people or anything like that, even though it seems inevitable. It's something you can't avoid, which John Mara refuses to accept. But the reality is that you have ownership into these positions and it's creating a dynamic that hasn't worked for whatever reason, whether they're bad at their job or whether that this dynamic doesn't allow people to operate and do their job correctly. Because a guy in Jerry Reese, who was a guy who won us 2 Super Bowl, who was operating as one of the best GMs in the NFL, suddenly this wasn't a good GM anymore after these moves, and we haven't been able to get a good GM in there since. And I think that there's a variety of reasons for that. I don't think it's just Tim McDonald, Chris Mayer being in these roles. There's reasons these guys are inept outside of that, but it plays a role. And the fact that these guys keep getting promoted over these time, I believe, Chris Mayer went on from being director to senior VP of player personnel. You know, Tim McDonald wants to be assistant director. Now he's director of play personnel, and then follows Joe Shane and Brandon Brown everywhere. They're the three musketeers. Those are the guys. Those are the three-headed monster that leads this crappy team that we have. And guess what? If Tim McDonald was any other person, you would say, hey, you're a nice enough guy. You work hard. I appreciate everything you did here. It's not working out. Sorry. We need to go a different direction. Can't do that. He's the owner. So what do? Now, John Mara put himself into a position where he is going to have to make a tough decision at some point and make a change in a position he should have never allowed himself to get put into if he heeded George Young's warning. But we are where we are right now, and he needs to find a position to change. And I want to hand it back to you, Sal. But one last thing I kind of want to say on this to kind of like maybe get you some of your thoughts on this. I want Tim McDonald to be great. He is going to be our owner one day. Everybody knows that. He's getting primed to be our owner. But to me, great. Like, it's nice you got some experience in the player personnel. I probably would have just stopped it at scout, but it's nice you got experience. But that's not how John Mara got his start. Chris Mara got his start, and Chris Mara isn't the CEO of the Giants right now. It's John Mara. John Mara started on the board. John Mara made his career on the board and then became the owner. If you are priming Tim McDonald to take over as owner, move him to the board where you started. Move him underneath you. Move him to that side of operations. Why is he on football operations when you're not an organization that you want to run that way? You claim you're not the Dallas Cowboys. You claim you're not the Cincinnati Bengals. So why are you priming your future owner in player evaluations? If he is going to be our owner, why is he there? Why is he not working under you? Why is he on that side of the building? Because if you don't want him to be Jerry Jones one day, then don't put him in the position where he feels like he can be Jerry Jones.
It's because they want to do everything the Joneses do, but they think they can get away with it without being called out for it. That's the reality. There's really not much difference between the Maras and the Joneses in their desire to run the team their way, which is their right. They own it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Until Steve Tisch has something to say about it, but that's a different discussion. They can run it however they want. The difference is Jerry Jones is honest about it and says, "Me and my son, we do everything." Yeah, that Will McClay guy, he does the draft, right? He does the draft, and we basically sign off on his draft picks. But everything else, the contract decisions, just the overarching, organizational philosophy, that's us. We do everything. We pay, we don't pay, we trade, whatever. They take ownership of it. The Maras do not want to take ownership, but they want to do the same thing. That's the reality. They want to have this shadow control. And it's at this point, it's not they're if any of them ever heard us say this or were watching this, they probably, recoil in disgust and say that's such a made up narrative. But it's the truth.
Yep.
They want shadow control of the team without having to stand in front of the spotlight and say, yeah, I did this. That decision, that quarterback contract, I had something to do with it, right? I had input. I'm not absolving Joe Shane, by the way. We'll get to that. But yeah, I put my thumb on the scale for sure on that. They don't want to admit that they screwed up there. They don't want to admit that maybe they have something to do with other decisions, like not trading Saquon Barkley, because an ownership group that takes ownership of their decisions will come out and say, "I stopped my GM from trading Saquon Barkley when the team needed to trade him, when we were going to lose him." Right? So the ownership of this team wants to operate like the Joneses, but doesn't want the accountability that comes with it. They don't want the smoke. They just want to be able to run it in their own way, interfere and mingle. And what I mean, think about it. What else do they have to do all day? I have a day
Mhm.
job. You have a day job. Everybody here has a day job. We do this for our own. Now, I can't say it's fun. We do it because we have a toxic relationship that we're addicted to with this team.
Yeah,
Um, but they have no day job. This is their day job. That's all they do is the Giants. Can you just imagine this for a second? You're a billionaire. You have complete control of this team. All you do is this team. This is all you do. You have a bunch of people who do literally nothing else except this team. And every year, you're a bottom feeder. You're a cockroach. You're a 3-win, 4-win embarrassment. You are the outlier of outlier in terms of outcomes in a league that is built for parity. That even if you just hit auto draft every day, every year, and say, I'm not doing la la la, I'm not doing anything. I'm just hitting auto draft and I'm just going to let AI, I'm going to let ChatGPT run my team. Odds are you're going to be somewhere between 6 and 10 wins more years than not. You're going to live in that territory, right? That's the way the NFL is designed. For you to live between 2, 3, and 5 wins literally every year except for one for like a decade, that requires a certain level of idiocy, like a unique end of the curve level of incompetence that you have to almost try to achieve. And that is without a doubt a familial trait. This is coming from the top down. And until they change how they manage this organization and step away, I don't think we can expect substantially different results.
it's because they work off of emotions and arrogance. They have arrogance that they aren't the problem and that they're going to fix this, and they work off emotions with there's loyalties to the people in this building and to, like, I mean, even a guy I love to death, even right there, Eli Manning. Their refusal to move off this man is what separates them from the successful teams, because successful teams understand when it's time to move on.
The
When
49ers moved off of Joe Montana, the greatest quarterback that had ever lived until that point, after winning 4 Super Bowls for them. They moved off him.
they understand the time, you have a guy, your head coach, who you fired, one of the greatest head coaches of all time of your Giants franchise, Tom Coughlin. You fired him partially because you were terrified of losing Ben McAdoo to the Philadelphia Eagles. You had that much trust in Ben McAdoo. Ben McAdoo takes you to the playoffs. His first year as a head coach goes 11-5. He tells you he is in love with Patrick Mahomes. That's who he wants to get his hands on, and no one else gives his thought the light of day, despite firing Tom Coughlin for him, despite him taking to his playoffs in his first year. You ignore him. He goes and sees Patrick Mahomes as pro day by himself. And what happens? Patrick Mahomes goes on and he's one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, because you weren't willing to, you know, do what, like, the Green Bay Packers do. They want to try to, they wanted to try to do it with Daniel Jones when Eli Manning had no time left and was not going to even last 6 games before getting benched for Daniel Jones, when you could have felt like you did it there and gave Patrick Mahomes actual time to develop and done something like that, the Green Bay method. But no, you wouldn't even consider it. And then those guys bench Eli Manning. And let's put that into perspective, Sal. I think this is a good conversation here too. Jerry Reese and Ben McAdoo, they bench Eli Manning because John Mara comes to Jerry Reese and Ben McAdoo and says, don't you think it's about time we start to get a look at some of these other quarterbacks on the roster? And they're like, know what? We've been thinking the same thing. Let's get a plan for doing that. They get a plan for doing that. Their plan is they want Eli Manning to start the game. They're going to pull him and get a look at the other quarterbacks. They take that plan to Eli Manning. Eli says, nope, I don't want that. He says, either you're going to start me or you're going to bench me. You make up your mind. So they moved forward and benched Eli Manning. Just, as they talked about with John Mara, that, that's to move forward. Eli reject. What are you going to do? Eli rejected your plan to start him. So there's fan outrage. That happens. You have to deal with it sometimes. Instead of falling on the sword and saying, hey, us as an organization decided this was the best thing to do. And for the record, a guy in Geno Smith, who is now a very good quarterback in the NFL, you wanted to get a look at. You tried to get a look at. And because you gave, which is also a very bad look, this happened after you gave the start to the first black starter in Giants history. You, following that game, you fire Jerry Reese, your two-time Super Bowl winning GM, who is still not in your Ring of Honor. You fire your head coach, who just went 11-5 before the season ends, because you're unwilling to take any criticism for something that you orchestrated. So you threw these guys under the bus and fired them. And I'm not saying they didn't deserve to end up being fired, but you promised. You went out in the media and made a point. These guys will not be fired midseason. And you fired them midseason because you were too cowardly to take the fans' reaction yourself. And you acted out of emotions, as we've been saying has been a problem with this organization. Do you want to chime in on that, Sal?
Yeah, I've brought this point up that it was Mara who initiated the process to bench Eli and see other players, because it's documented through the Tyler Dunn autopsy report, through Dan Duggan's report, through a lot of reports from that era, that as Eli, who again, I love Eli, right? My favorite player of all time. I love it to this day, but when it was clear to all of us after the 2015, he had it, right? But the defense was terrible. But in 2016, when McAdoo in his first year was head coach, you could tell that Eli wasn't the same guy, right? And it was, we thought maybe it was a change to McAdoo's system of like that sort of like 3-step drop and quick throws and changing his footwork and all the stuff they were doing to change an older quarterback, which I never really thought made a lot of sense. But anyway, you could tell he was beginning to lose it, right? And but they still went. They went 10-6. They went to the playoffs. They lost in that game. That was the whole Bo Trip year. By 2017, it was very clear Eli didn't have it anymore, right? Because his whole game was being a gunslinger and having, the ability to drive the ball down the field and beat teams with big plays. That was Eli, right? And clutch moments. He just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't move. His arm was getting weaker. Everything was falling apart. He was getting old. Guys get old. And the fact that John Mara recognized that, and it's reported that he would sit after games and they would be angry, like, God damn, we lost another game because Eli sucked. We lost another game because Eli couldn't do it. They were frustrated and they would openly say it. But come Monday morning, when people in the front office, scouts would sit down and say, okay, we got to address this for the future. Mara's response immediately was, no, no, no. This is Eli's team. So they didn't know where to go, right? I'm talking about the scouts who had been built for years under Jerry Reese, and before that by Ernie Accorsi, and before that by George Young. There was a time where the New York Giants personnel division, their scouts, were a really well-oiled machine, right? And they had a good grasp of what the organization needed. They were guys who had a lot of loyalty to Reese, who treated them very well. They had a good system. They didn't hit every year, right? There were definitely issues with the drafts, especially towards the end of Reese's years. But they knew there was a problem and they were trying to help the organization. And Mara's response was, this is Eli's team. Just figure it out, right? And they operated that way. So he wants to bench him. He cowardly fires the two men he tells to bench him because they benched him and because Eli got upset and cried. And the fans got upset because they watched their champion crying, and the fan reaction was, anger, which is understandable. He's a legend, and I was upset. I was like, what are they doing? What is this
Mm-hmm.
stupid idea, right? What are they doing? This guy, like, if you're gonna bench him, just bench him. Why are you coming up with this cockamamie idea? If you know Eli, he's never gonna go for some stupid idea like that, right? He was an Iron Man. He was an all team guy, but they fired Jerry Reese. I mean, McAdoo, it's unfair, but whatever. Jerry Reese was your GM for 2 Super Bowl victories. You fired that man on a Monday morning for doing what you said. What kind of a spineless coward does something like that? Why? Because you couldn't stand up in front of the media and say, I told them to do that. You couldn't go to Eli and say, "This was my idea, Eli." It's not theirs. You couldn't go to your team and say, "This was my idea," because we have to move forward. If he had just the basic spine of a normal man and stood up and just said, "This was me," and not blamed others for his own decision, you have to wonder where this organization would be, right? Maybe, just maybe, he lets Ben McAdoo finish the season. Maybe they win some games with Geno Smith or Davis Webb, and he sees, hey, it was actually quarterback play that was a problem, and Ben McAdoo was right. Just maybe. I'm not saying McAdoo is a great coach or anything, but maybe, just maybe, if he does that and he allows them to do their job, they go all in and take Patrick Mahomes. Where would this organization be if they had just done those things? Right? If he and it
Mhm.
literally comes down to John Mara not telling his team, his front office, and his coach to do something, and then firing them for doing it. It's gutless.
And then, falls at, like I said, doesn't even let two-time Super Bowl champion Jerry Reese finish out the season, fires him, and then they go on an apology tour to Eli Manning. They go against their better judgment when John Mara himself acknowledged they needed to get a look at these other QBs. He knew it was the end for Eli Manning, but he wanted to hear otherwise. He went to a guy, Dave Gettleman, who was willing to tell him that, hey, I still think we can make it work with this guy, Eli. Instead, let's look at this. Let's look at the reality of this. In the worst season, probably the worst couple of the worst season I've ever seen from the Giants these last 2 years. Some of the worst play, if you go back and look at the EPA, all this, all just some terrible, terrible, terrible teams. The Giants right now are in line for the fourth pick in not even that great of a quarterback draft. Last year, a really good quarterback draft. They ended up with the sixth pick, despite how poor that team is. We ended up with the second pick in what was looked at as a historically good quarterback class. We struck gold. You know how everyone's jealous of the Patriots right now? How the hell did the Patriots go from Tom Brady to Drake May? The football gods tried, as much as we swear at the football gods, they handed us our future on a platter and said, "Here you go. Here's a group of quarterbacks you can take. You can get Sam Darnold, who took some time, but he's looking like a franchise guy. You can get Josh Allen, who looks like he's about to win an MVP. You could get Lamar Jackson, who's won multiple MVPs. Like you can get no, you didn't have a shot at Baker, but regardless, he's starting to put it together. Josh Rosen was really the only guy who missed out of those quarterbacks in that first round. You had an opportunity. Hell, you could have traded down and you still could have gotten your quarterback. You could have gotten Saquon Barkley probably still. If not, Quentin Nelson, Bradley Chubb, and you could have came back up for Lamar Jackson. You were given so many opportunities to save this franchise that draft. And Dave Gettleman had no interest doing it because he was serving what the Giants organization wanted, which was to build around Eli Manning. And that's all they cared about. They didn't care about, what was best for the future of the New York Giants, which in the prime opportunity to get there. There's one story I want to tell because actually it was a little bit in this articles. I think it was in Tyler Dunn's with the autopsy, but I actually read a book that he was referencing. There's a book called So You Want to Be an NFL Scout. I have this book. It's by Steven Verdosa. He's a former scout for the New York
Oh,
Giants.
Steve Verdosa, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Twitter legend.
He went through his full time here, and you can see the tone change when Dave Gettleman talks over. He speaks so highly of everybody he works with. He speaks so highly of Jerry Reese. He speaks so highly of Ernie, of course. He speaks so highly of George Jung, so highly of these guys. And then he talks about like just toxic type environment that Dave Gettleman put out. He talks about how this was a wild story. They had Bradley Chubb and Saquon Barkley as the same grade on their board. He has this, and he argues to them, goes, "Hey, you have the same grade on these guys. Edge rushers last longer. Edge rushers are more valuable. If we have the same grade, I think we should go with the edge rusher.
Makes sense.
Next day, the day before the draft, he comes in. Saquon Barkley magically got bumped up, just a point, out of
Imagine
nowhere,
that.
day
Yeah.
before the draft. So the argument was gone. And the way that he also alluded to this thing in the article, and I recommend anybody to read the book, and you can interpret it the way you want. But the way he said it was that it sounded like the quarterbacks are kind of like right after this. He basically said it like they weren't in the same group as these guys, so we were never going to consider them. But then came the quarterback. So like you like the quarterbacks enough, just you didn't think you need one, so you're going to go with the BPA. You had your opportunity. And
Sound familiar?
yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, we should get to the Joe Shane era, but I want to say, I want to give you another Dave Gettleman gem story. 2019, a year later. So so he gets the job because, so sequence of events. Eli cries, John Mara, becomes an amoeba, no spine, fires the men he tells to bench Eli and fires them for benching Eli. Then goes on an apology tour where he wants to do everything in his power to show the world that he believes in Eli. And that's his guiding principle, not what's best for the Giants, just to prove Eli's good. He still got it. Hires a GM who comes from their world, who was a miserable failure of a GM in Carolina. And people are going to say to me, well, he took them to the Super Bowl. No, he didn't. The roster that went to the Super Bowl was not built by Dave Gettleman. He added a couple of decent players, but he inherited a very good team. And anyway, he comes here. Why does he get the job? Because he is willing to say to them, Eli Manning's got it and I can build. If you're hiring somebody and what your criteria for hiring them is, they are going to tell you exactly what you need to hear, right? Just self gratification, right? To hear that what you are believing is correct, and you're going to hire the guy that says that. It's very easy to get a job when you have an employer like that. It's very easy. All you have to know is, what does that guy want to hear? I'll just say it and I'll get the job, whether it's right or wrong. So anyway, he comes in. The Barkley thing is well documented. The 2018 draft. Eli's continuing to fall apart in 18. He's a disaster, a shell of his former self. 2019 comes around. They want Justin Herbert. They have the 6th pick in the draft. They want him. They want him. They want him. They visit him. Just like Dave Gettleman Jr., they're telling the whole world who they love as a quarterback. We'll get to Dave Gettleman Jr. in a second. Everybody knows. So Justin Herbert is looking at Dave Gettleman, this awkward, obese man in flip-flops, staring at him in a really weird way all the time in Oregon. And he's like, I think I'm going to play another year here with my brother. Right? And he doesn't come out. That class, the 2019 draft class, was a historically good defensive class. There are very few classes in NFL history that produce defensive players like that one, and you knew it in real time. The Giants had Eli. They were stuck with Eli. They passed on their quarterback ability the year before when they had a shot. And here they were with the 6th overall pick in a 1-quarterback class. Let's be real. That was a 1-quarterback class. You had Kyler Murray and a bunch of guys with nothing but question marks. But among the question marks were Dwayne Haskins, God rest his soul, who was at least a prolific passer at Ohio State and grew up a Giants fan and wanted to be a Giant. And whether you guys wanted him or not, that's not the point. He at least had something on his resume. You had Drew Lock, who will go down in infamy as a man who ruined the next decade for the Giants. And you had guys like Paxton Lynch, I think, was in that class, right?
No,
Or he wasn't. I'm sorry. It was Daniel Jones and I think Will Greer was in
Will
that
Greer
class.
was the other one.
Your guy, Will Greer,
Yeah,
and
Will Greer.
and the second best quarterback of that class, what's his face? The guy who's in Oakland now, who ended up going in the 7th round.
Minshew. Yep.
So all these other guys are bunched over here. Kyler's the obvious number one. Arizona takes him. That whole thing is well documented. They trade Josh Rosen. Fine. The Giants are scouting. They apparently fall full bloom in love. When I say they, I mean Gettleman and Shermer. Full bloom in love. Based on what? If for those who don't know, the Senior Bowl. Not the practice that actually matters, even. Not that the Senior Bowl should matter. By the way, this is a public service message. Before it starts, if your assessment of football players is based on the Senior Bowl, please don't share your assessment. It is stupid. Please watch college football. The Senior Bowl is an exhibition for certain guys to try to build their stock up a little bit. It is not where you learn who's good and who's not. If you're basing your assessments on the Senior Bowl, you're doing it wrong. And I know a lot of people with a lot of clout love to do that, and it's a ridiculous way to scout. Anyway, that's an aside.
The only good thing about it is Jim Nagy does a hell of a job knowing who to bring in. That's the best thing you got about it.
He's a great agent, is what he is, for those players. But anyway, so this idiot goes to the Senior Bowl, falls full bloom in love in the game. In the game. Nobody watches the freaking Senior Bowl game because he sees 3 drives by Daniel Jones, Senior Bowl MVP Daniel Jones. He sees 3 drives and falls full bloom in love and says, that's a leader that I need on my team. Fast forward to the draft. Nobody, and I mean nobody inside the Giants building was hearing one word out of Dave Gettleman about Daniel Jones. I don't know if you guys know this story. He did not discuss Daniel Jones with anybody. He didn't talk about it. He kept it. I mean, I'm talking about with his close advisors. I'm talking with the assistant GM, player personnel guys, the scouts. Nobody. He's not saying a word about Daniel Jones. And they were wondering, like, why isn't he talking about him, right? So I think there were people in the building who were like, well, I mean, he's not talking about him. He's probably not going to take him, you know? And then he hands in the card and takes Daniel Jones because he unilaterally decided, I'm going to take it. Think about this for a second. This is a guy who had a day 2, possibly a day 3 grade coming out of school. Let's be generous and say it was a day 2 grade. He was an objectively bad quarterback at Duke. He was not good. He was being graded based off traits and nothing else, really. There was not much to go by. People fell in love with the fact that he was 6'5" and he was David Cutcliffe's, protege, whatever. But nobody had him ranked as like a top prospect. He wasn't even close. Like, people complain about guys like JJ and Penix. Those guys had serious resumes. This guy had nothing. So Dave Gettleman, instead of like saying, I'm interested in this guy, I'd like to take him, and letting the expertise in the room actually say, let's dissect his game. Let's interview the kid. Let's find out what we can about him. Let's go through his history. Let's watch his game tape. Let's really, if we're going to put our organization's future on this quarterback at the 6th overall pick, let's do a dissection. None of that happened. None of that happened. Dave Gettleman didn't tell a soul about it and then just handed in the card. I don't know if you guys know that story, but that's actually how it went down. Now, there were rumblings. People were suspecting he would do it. Obviously, Dan Jeremiah was talking about it. There were probably some people who suspected he would do it, but he really did not go through an in-depth evaluation, internal evaluation with his brain trust about the quarterback that literally was plaguing this organization until about 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago. That's how that went down.
Wraps.
That's how that went down. Think how ridiculous is that?
So they had so many fucking leaks, and they didn't, because they refused to fire anybody.
Right. So anyway, that's the last story I want to share with you guys about the Gettleman era, because it tells you about the sequence of events of nepotism, right? Wellington dies, John takes over, Chris Mara starts coming in, he gets blocked from GM, Tim McDonald slides in, he's basically like a personnel guy that just slides in with minimal experience. By all accounts, a good guy, nice guy. I don't think he's toxic by any means, but by merit, he shouldn't be in his position. And here we are. Gettleman gets a job because he's a nepotism hire. Basically, he's not exactly nepotism. He's not family, but he's close to it. And then 2021 ends. Joe Judge mercifully makes a buffoon out of himself, so we get to move on from him, even though they try to keep him. And I think, I'll let you go, but why don't you take it from there? And because I think it's time we start dissecting Joe Schoen.
Yeah. I wanted to add one more thing before we move down to Joe Schoen, just from the 2019 draft, because I think that was a really interesting first round. Outside of what even happened with Daniel Jones, there's 2 other stories that I can kind of touch on real quick that happened during that draft. One, Dexter Lawrence, the guy that people credit. Granted, greatest pick Dave Gettleman ever made was Dexter Lawrence with the 17th pick he got from OBJ. Credit to him there. But do you know? He tried to trade out of that pick not 1, but 2 times. First time, he immediately tried to trade up for Josh Allen after passing on him, a guy that he could have had at 6. Decided to immediately trade up for him because he wanted him so bad, but he wasn't willing to pass on Daniel Jones for whatever reason. And then when he couldn't get Josh Allen, he went and tried to trade up to number 10 so he can get Devin Bush, and then lost out to the Steelers, who was a total bust, by the way.
Yeah.
And then his third option, he got Dexter Lawrence. Hey, sometimes it's better to be lucky than be good. And that's what he was there. But they trade back into that first round. They get another first round pick. And this was a guy that the front office did not want them to take. All of Dave Gettleman's scouts who were in the area of DeAndre Baker in Georgia warned Dave Gettleman that what they heard was this was a guy who won't respond to text. This is a guy who doesn't pay attention. This is a guy who doesn't work hard. There's all these question marks about his work ethic and who he is as a person. All these are show up. And granted, from it sounds like Dave Gettleman took that under consideration. But the issue is Dave Gettleman was bad, but he was also a puppet. Dave Gettleman, you hear story after story about, oh, Dave Gettleman's guy. This was Jason Garrett's guy. This was Joe Judge's guy. This was Pat Shurmur's guy. And in this case, it was Pat Shurmur's guy. Pat Shurmur wanted DeAndre Baker, and he didn't have the spine to say, our scouts have red flagged this guy. We are not taking DeAndre Baker. That's it. End of story. That's what we have taken this guy off. We are not trading up for him. We are red flagging this guy. We are not taking DeAndre Baker. Instead, after incessant begging from Pat Shurmur, he went up and got DeAndre Baker because he doesn't have a goddamn spine, which is exactly why the Giants hired him, because he would be able to do whatever they wanted to do. And this quote unquote shadow scouting that people refer to with all these close connections back there with Tim McDonald, who was very close with Chris Pettit before they fired him, Chris Mara, who wants to be the GM, was supposed to be the GM. John Mara was going to make him the GM, and then Steve Tisch had to come in and stop it, and they made Jerry Reese the GM instead. We would have been the Dallas Cowboys, for the record. If it was up to John Mara, we would have been. As much as he says, there isn't nepotism, we aren't run by owners, not because of him. And there is still something going on. But if it was up to him, Chris Mara would have been our GM. And he probably would still be our GM till today, because you don't fire ownership. And we would have been screwed. And we probably don't have 2 Super Bowls right now. So we don't have the most recent 2, I should say. But that leads us into Joe Judge.
And the post 2021, right?
Mm-hmm.
Post 2021, the outcry. I think this was sort of giant Twitter's like prime heyday, right? The outcry of Giants Twitter, the backlash when the Giants were making a strong push to keep Joe Judge while allowing Dave Gettleman, the war criminal, to retire. I'll just say that they allowed him to retire. The GM that won you 2 Super Bowls got unceremoniously fired midseason for doing what you wanted, but you allowed this disaster of a human being to retire anyway.
Who Steve Tisch wanted to fire after 2 years.
Right. Giants Twitter and Giants fans all over fight back, and that was probably their greatest moment, where they basically bullied the Giants organization through both fan pressure and media pressure to cave. And Steve Tisch steps in and says, "No, enough is enough. We're not doing this. We're going to clean house." Awesome. They start a thorough job search, and they really had and when you look back at their GM search, it was really an impressive list of people. Obviously, Joe Shane, and to be fair to Joe Shane, this is coming off the heels of the Buffalo Bills' iconic division game loss in the playoffs to Kansas City, the 13-second game, where Josh Allen had 4 touchdown passes to Gabe Davis and looks like this superstar, right? Like everything came together for Josh Allen, and they did everything in their power with Brian Dable leading that offense to win that game. And Sean McDermott and the defense just kind of screwed up at the end, and Patrick Mahomes did his thing, and that was that. So they were riding high, and they were definitely high up there on a lot of teams' lists, meaning Joe Shane and Brian Dable. But they're on the list. Ryan Poles was on the list. Adam Peters, the assistant GM of the 49ers at the time, the current GM of the Commanders, on the list. Um, Joel Hurtis, the current GM of the LA Chargers, previously,
So I
I
want
forgot he was in Baltimore. I forgot his exact role at the time. I don't know if he was assistant GM or he was director of player personnel. He was
I think
something,
he was director of player personnel, former director of college scouting, I believe.
right? Coming from the Ozzie Newsome tree. He was on the list. So they had an impressive list of candidates.
Very.
And, and the finalists were ultimately Ryan Poles, Adam Peters, and Joe Shane. I mean, it's a solid trio. Again, you have to think about this in real time, not with the Joe Shane, today's glasses of looking at him. At the time, he was viewed as a hot candidate. They go with Joe Shane, and it's widely reported that Joe Shane was sort of the internal guy to begin with. He had the inside track on the job because of his connections to Bill Parcells and you know who else?
So,
Dave Gettleman. You know, they're
yeah,
connected the Carolina connection
indirectly
indirectly, but
through
Bill
Brandon Bean.
Parcells, yeah, through Brandon Bean, but basically he's another Parcells guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Brian Dable is kind of a Bill Belichick guy. They love drawing from that. So they have the inside track. Adam Peters was so good apparently and so impressive in his interview that it was reported that they did not expect to have it get close, but he
Mm-hmm.
pushed them to the brink where they almost had to hire him because he was so good. But they ultimately chose to just give it to the guy who had the inside track. I'm not going to play Monday morning quarterback, on that particular decision because I think most of us, myself included, were very happy that they made the call to actually bring in somebody from the outside. Even if there was some connection to Parcells, it was fine. They brought in Joe Shane. Most people wanted Brian Dable as a head coach. He brings in
Mm-hmm.
Brian Dable. Stop right there.
I think the connection is why a lot of people wanted it. Like Joe Shane was a good candidate. He was up there, like fully. Somebody wanted, but everyone wanted Brian Dable. So they're like, all right,
Right.
we'll get both these together. You get a quality GM candidate and our top head coach candidate. Let's do that. That's what a lot of people's minds were at the time.
Exactly. So anyway, that happens, right? But during that process, what's going on in the background? Brian Flores had just been fired by the Miami Dolphins. And I mean, for those who don't know, I mean, obviously he's a hot name now, but Brian Flores, comes from the Bill Belichick tree, native of Brooklyn, um, had a tumultuous time as a person in Miami. The whole well documented terrible relationship with Tua, all sorts of I think he kicked a kicker or something. He had some crazy behavior out there, right? Oh no, I'm sorry, that was Urban Meyer. He didn't do that, but he was kind
Mm-hmm.
of verbally abusive to to players at the time. He was a hard ass. He came from the Belichick tree, but a good coach with a winning record. I think he was coming off a 10-win season when he was fired, if I'm not mistaken. Um, he wants the job. He's a defensive coach. All the rage was get an offensive coach in those days, right? Get an offensive coach. We want Brian Dable. You want to be connected to the GM. Tim McDonald is running, he's running a shadow hiring process again, where he's like telling Brian Flores, he's texting him and saying, "You're my guy. We want you. Like me and John, we want you to get the job. The owners, we want you to get the job." They're texting him this shit. He has those texts. That's part of his lawsuit today,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we're pulling for you. We want you to do a great job. We're pulling for you. We want you to get the job. We want you to knock this out of the park. They're telling him they want to hire him, despite the fact that they just hired a GM specifically to take them out of this process, right? So GM gets to choose his coach, but they're doing this with Brian Flores on the side. And it's well documented that ultimately the Giants hire Brian Dable. Bill Belichick sends that tweet to, I'm sorry, he sends a text message to Brian Flores saying, "Congratulations, you got the job." And I still don't think he did that by accident, but whatever. Um, and Flores is like, "Great," and he's like, "Oh, wait a minute." He's like, "Really? I haven't heard anything." He's like, "Oh, wait a minute, wrong Brian, sorry." Like, whatever, right? And Flores uses that and says, "Wait a minute, why does he know about this? Why is the owner texting me that I'm going to get the job or I should get the job and then I don't get it?" And he files his lawsuit. And he's got a good damn case at
Mm-hmm.
that point about hiring processes. But all of that could have been avoided if Tim McDonald and John Mara are not texting the candidate directly outside of their general manager, and B, not texting freaking Bill Belichick, who's the head coach of another football team at the time, telling them about what they want to do.
Yeah.
They're doing this on the side. And that's how the Joe Shane era began here.
Yeah. And look. and this is just falling, just falling. John Mayer coming out and saying the media made up this nepotism rumor. This is all made up. There's Tim McDonald doesn't have more power than anybody else in the front office. Just says this a week ago. And then, the next week following, text that Tim McDonald never thinks he's going to get out. Because why would he? Why would he think that we ever see this? But we do. He receives a text from Tim McDonald. They get on a phone call together. We don't know what happens on the phone call, but they get on a phone call together. He tells him before he gets the job, come in and win this effing job. He wants him to get this job. He's trying to get him the job. Obviously, I'll say shout out to one thing the mayor is like, I don't like how involved there, and I think it's very problematic, but, they let Joe Shane bring in who they wanted to bring because they clearly wanted Brian Flores, but they let Joe Shane pick his guy. So credit to them for doing that. But this is still problematic. This completely goes against what you're saying, where you're saying that Tim McDonald has no more power than anybody. He's hiring the guys that you're bringing in. He's their boss. He brings them in. Same with Chris Mara. Chris Mara and Tim McDonald interview these guys for their jobs. And you're trying to say that they have no more power than anybody else in that role. It's a ridiculous assertion that they're making. It's completely insane. They can get away with things that other people can get away with. There's no consequences for them. It's problematic.
They do this. Brian Flores files his lawsuit. That's how the Joe Shane tenure with Brian Dable begins. And then obviously it's well documented that, the Giants go on, they have a good season. And so they turned down Daniel Jones' fifth year option. I think we should start there. They have a chance, they have their first draft. And we know about Joe Shane's drafting record. But that weekend of the draft, they say no to Daniel Jones' fifth year option. They have their fun during the 2022 season. They have 9 wins. They make the playoffs. It's all, we all know this, what happened in the Minnesota game, all that crap. At the end of the day, it's time to pay both Saquon Barkley and Daniel Jones, or make a decision on them rather. And we get to that point, right? That critical point, which is really the inflection point that ruined the Giants for several more years, right? The way they handled that. By the way, that's the moment that's actually when Monty and I became friends and decided we would come up with an idea for a pod. Was during that time. Because he kept trying to talk me into this idea that no, they'll be smart, they'll transition tag Jones, and I was like, no, they're gonna fuck this up. But anyway, at that moment, Joe Shane kind of showed who he is, right? That he really was. He was an inside hire. I mean, he showed his. I kept thinking about Joe Shane when I read a passage. I think it was from the Tyler Dunn article written years ago, when he said that it was a scout or who a former scout who was saying something along the lines of, they just want somebody to come in and tell them what they want to hear themselves. That's all they want. They want yes men. They don't want accountability. They don't want the truth. They want somebody who's going to give them what they want, tell them what they want, tell them that everything's going to be okay with the players that they like and with what they themselves view as the right thing to do. That's all they want. They want yes men. They want sycophants. And Joe Shane behaved like a sycophant. John Mara came out famously after the Minnesota playoff victory and said, "We're back. Daniel, we love Daniel, blah, 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 all this crap," right? Steve Tisch was more reserved, but John Mara was through the roof. He said it was very gratifying to see him perform like that. He felt like his evaluation, his family's evaluation of Daniel Jones was justified. Joe Shane behaves that way during the negotiations. In the negotiations, Athletes First is absolutely horsing him, right? They're offering obscene numbers. Nobody, like, take a step back. Nobody in their right mind would pay Daniel Jones any kind. He sucks. He had a few decent games in 2022, but he was like a Marcus Mariota, Blake Bortles level player. These guys don't get paid money. And they're saying, give us 50 million, give us 45 million, give us 47 million. And Joe Shane is sitting there just dealing with them like, okay. Like, they're having a hard time. They're talking about his wife, and he's just like, oh, okay, I'll figure it out with you. He's yes manning everything Mara wants. And at the 11th hour, when Shane is beginning to, he's feeling it like I don't want to fuck this up. This will ruin my career. I'm sure he felt that, right? On the final day with the deadline. What does Daniel Jones do? Well, again, well documented in the Albert Breer article. At around 10 a.m., he's at the facility working out while his agents are negotiating with Joe Shane, and they're like 6 hours from the deadline, before the tag deadline. And Daniel Jones goes up to Joe Shane and says, "I'm going to call John, just letting you know. Good luck. I hope you guys work it out. I'm going to call John." He called John Mara and is like, "I just want you to know, no hard feelings, John. Whatever happens, I want to stay here, whether it's in a contract or a franchise tag." What do you think happened after that? Why would Daniel Jones do that? Daniel Jones is indecisive. He can't read a defense. He can't do a lick of shit when he puts on a uniform. But when he's negotiating contracts and dealing with money, he's a fierce warrior. He did that, called John Mara, and he put his thumb on the scale of this via John Mara, who then obviously, I would have to guess, had some influence on Joe Shane at that point. And Joe Shane, being the spineless twit that he is, caves and gives a 4-year, $160 million contract with 3 minutes left to go to a terrible quarterback. And that's why we're here. So again, nepotism from John Mara and their people insisting that they got something in Jones, but also in hiring a guy who just, sure, John, we're going to do this.
A guy that John Mara loved, that Chris Mara loved, that the ownership was in love with. Daniel Jones, the guy they're very high of, a guy that Joe Shane just 9 months earlier declined the 5th-year option on, and now suddenly is willing to pay him after a team success year, pretty good season. You see a guy like Geno Smith, who had a much better year, get a very reasonable contract, gets about like $30 million a year, a 1 year out. We decided to pay him $40 million a year. We're touting this 2-year out we have, while we still have to pay him $22 million dead money. Just to be clear, just put on how ridiculous that was, that people were bragging about that. Baker Mayfield, who's only getting paid $33 million a year, who had a better year, also won a playoff game against a better team in his first year at the Buccaneers, almost the same age as Daniel Jones. The Buccaneers could get out of Baker Mayfield after 1 year right now if they wanted to, for less money than we're going to give Daniel Jones this offseason that we already gave him. Gave him less dead money than we're giving if they want to get out after 1 year for a better deal. And when they were so scared to let him try free agency, like that there was this magic team that was going to drive up the price on them. It was cowardly. It was cowardly by Joe Shane, who wouldn't stick to his plan, that either was stupidly blinded by minimal success where they won a bunch of close games, or was influenced and didn't have the spine to stand up to his owner and stick what he believes in. Both things are equally as bad. I don't know what it is. It's equally as bad.
Yeah. And that brings us to where we are, right? I mean, they make that ridiculous decision, and it becomes very clear to most of us, I think, that we're looking at this objectively, that you know the hiring of Shane, while we applauded it in real time, everything he did after that first season, it's hard to tell the difference between what he did and what Dave Gettleman would have done. You tell me what the difference is. You know, he signs Dave Gettleman's quarterback. He goes out of his way to keep Dave Gettleman's running back and signs the quarterback to a deal so he can tag the running back. I mean, this is a very Dave Gettleman like move. He he shits the bed in the draft a couple of times, just completely botches it. He overpays for free agents. He over, you know, he trades better than Dave Gettleman. I'll give him that. He's made a couple of good trades, so you got to give him some credit. But look at the trade he made. In a nutshell, we like Brian Burns. He's young. He's an edge rusher. He's a good player, right? But you got him at a time when you were desperately in need of quarterback, and you made that move for him when there are outstanding edge rushers out there in free agency, right? We talked about this last year. Danielle Hunter's out there. Uh, Jonathan Grenard's out there. Van Ginkel's out there. There are a lot of good players that could be impact players for your team that are out there. Christian Wilkinson's as a defensive tackle is out there. So he trades a second and a fifth for Brian Burns and gives him a essentially $30 million a year contract at a time when they needed that pick to have any access at a quarterback. If they were trying, if their entire plan was trading up, which it obviously was, they didn't have any intention of sticking and picking at six. How is that different than the Leo move? I mean, I granted, edge is a little bit different than defensive tackle. How is it different than the Leo move? Tell me.
I would say the only difference I would do it is that the biggest mistake with Leo is that they went after they let him use all that leverage and they didn't have a deal in place. They made that trade without a deal in place, which ended up leading to a tag and then a record-setting deal
Okay,
instead of just getting the deal done.
Gettleman was historically stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, in my opinion, I've been watching New York sports for over 40 years. I think Dave Gettleman is probably the worst executive I've ever seen run any New York sports franchise in my lifetime. I'm beginning to wonder if it's actually Joe Shane because that's the world he's living in. He's not differentiating himself from Gettleman. Other than that, you're right. Other than the tag issue, at a time when they needed to be rebuilding this organization and focusing on quarterback, BPA, putting together a roster, hitting the reset button, realizing the Jones thing was a mistake, and still getting lucky, and the gods are sending you a second chance here to rebuild and start over. They're chasing an edge rusher who is a better version of the small bodied edge rusher you already drafted at fifth overall. A speed, first step, quickness guy, not a guy who sets the edge well, not a guy who's good in the run game. And you're paying him $30 million. It's like, why did you do it? Right? What was your plan? We applauded the move when he did it because what we thought was, okay, he's now going to sit and pick a quarterback at six. If he can't get up to pick three, which is what we all thought they were going to try to do, which they try to do. If he can't go there, he's not going to, like, nobody would be dumb enough to make this trade and not take their quarterback at six. It's insane to come in and pay a 25-year-old edge rusher $30 million a year on I think it's a 4-year deal or whatever it is, or a 5-year deal. It's insane to give that deal to an edge rusher and trade draft capital and then not get your quarterback to start building the team to make those contracts work, especially after you just paid Dexter Lawrence, you just paid Andrew Thomas. The clock is ticking on their contracts. The money is being spent, and you're not getting appreciable returns on those investments in any meaningful way for your team. You would think that the plan was just take a quarterback, then, right? You must be comfortable. They didn't do that. They took a wide receiver, a good one, but they took a wide receiver. They still don't have a quarterback solution, and now you got this overpriced player sitting in your edge room. He's a good football player. Is he a $30 million a year player? I don't know about that. Right. I mean, so it's there. The parallels are eerily similar, right?
And now, parallels aside, now the issue is that if you can't get a quarterback this year, the reality you're going to be stuck with is players like Brian Burns, players like Dexter Lawrence, players like Andrew Thomas, whoever it might be, guys who are in the prime of their career. What use do you have for them if you can't field a team to compete with? If you have a quarterback right now would still feel late. Last year would have still felt late. Year before would have been like it just didn't line up with a bad quarterback class. But the longer and longer you're pushing this out, it forces you to move on from it. And that's the last thing I want to do. I think, especially Dexter Lawrence, I think is a phenomenal player. And I think a player you can build a championship defense around. But the issue is if you don't get a quarterback, you're going to waste that guy's prime. And now you're looking at a guy like Brian Burns, who's not Dexter Lawrence's level. So that's a guy you'd probably want to move on before you moved on from a guy like Dexter Lawrence, because you're like, okay, like I can find another Brian Burns. I can't find another Dexter Lawrence. So you're going, what are we going to turn around and I'll trade Brian Burns if we can't get a quarterback? Because that's the position we're in. We are in you made this decision before you could find a quarterback, which is ridiculous. And now, I had people, which I understand, like, look, in a vacuum, I had people like, wouldn't you rather Malik Neighbors and Shador Sanders and or Cam Ward, or Cam Ward? I'm like, yeah, I mean, like over like JJ and Travis Hunter, probably it's close for me. I prefer JJ a little bit, but those three quarterbacks are in the same tier. I think I like Malik Neighbors for what he does a little bit better than Travis Hunter, even though Travis Hunter is a little bit more of a unique player. Regardless, there's an argument. It's close, but the difference is that comes with you getting a top 2 pick. That was if you got that pick, and that was no guarantee. And that's what I was saying people all the time. And look what happens now. Now the comparison is: would you rather JJ McCarthy and whoever is, Mason Graham, Will Johnson, Ted McMillan, whoever it is, or trade a first, a second, another second, and then have Malik Neighbors and Shador Sanders, or don't get a quarterback, or take Jalen Milrow, or where is that? So that's my issue. Is more the trade thing. You like, regardless, is if you like Shador Sanders and or Cam Ward more than JJ McCarthy, fine. But if your opinion is that you would not consider forget that at 6, you wouldn't have taken JJ McCarthy, Michael Penix, Bo Nix, any of them in the top 10. We saw your plan. We saw you put it on Hard Knocks. You told us even if you traded back, you weren't going quarterback. In no world were you taking a quarterback there. So that was your plan. So now you're going to turn around if we keep you, and you're going to try to sell me that you think Shador Sanders is, or Cam Ward is, a first, probably a second, and another second, something along those lines. That's going to be a relative value, maybe just a first and second. That's probably the low end of it. Think of what we traded for Eli. That was 4-1. Think of, things along those lines. That's around the package, and people consider that historically, when we look at it, it's kind of cheap what we paid for Eli. And so you look at that, that's what we're going to have to pay or go up. So is he that much better? And if you believe that, cool, but that's an outlier opinion. You look at every draft analyst, that's an outlier opinion. You can like him more, but to like him that much more, you're really trusting that Joe Shane knows what he's doing, is that much smarter than every other analyst. If hey, do you have that much trust in Joe Shane? Because I don't.
No. And I think when the draft came and went last year, we obviously had very strong takes on this. We said, if you want to trade up, get your guy, right? Go get Drake May, whatever. If you can't trade up, McCarthy, Penix, these guys are good enough to take. We were not big Bo Nix guys, but we even said, look,
Not
if
in
you
our
want to take
system.
him, not in our system, not in the Brian Dable system. That's why we weren't super high on him in a
You liked
in
him
a
West
McVay,
Coast.
right? In a West Coast system, Shanahan McVay, kind of what
Sean
Sean
Payton.
Payton is now running,
Mhm.
right? We thought he'd be a good fit, and lo and behold, he's a good fit. But anyway, we said in real time, if you don't take these quarterbacks, if you don't take a swing, and you just step away from this narrative that has been floating on Giants Twitter and the draft media, like this made up arbitrary threshold that you cannot take a quarterback unless you fall in love with them, like you're love, or that sounds like something freaking Dave Gettleman says, full bloom in love. Like you gotta love him, or you have to have conviction that he's the guy, or he has to be a top 5 quarterback. Like these are arbitrary, amoeba-like, non-definable descriptors. You can't define it. You can't quantify these ridiculous assertions that if he doesn't meet these criteria, you can't take him. How do you know he doesn't meet those criteria? Or how do you know he does? It's a ridiculous thing. There are objective ways to evaluate QB prospects, like there are objective ways to evaluate all other prospects. And at the end of the day, if a QB prospect is good enough, we made this a point in our QB episode. If they're good enough, if they cross the threshold, you should be willing to stick and pick and take the swing. And we said, just take the swing. If you fail, you fail, but you take the swing, and it allows you to build your roster out. And if you don't do it, meaning going back to last draft, if you don't do it now, what is your plan? Next year's class, meaning the class coming up now, we said it then. It was obvious. It's going to be a weak class. It's probably going to be a 2 quarterback class in terms of guys who are viewed as obvious top 10 type players, and they're probably going to go in the top 2 or 3 picks. So is your plan to have a top 2 or 3 pick? We said that in real time. Are you going
Yep.
to have a top 2, 3 pick? Is that really Is that really what you're going to plan for? Is that your quarterback solution? Because I don't see any other solution. And guess what? It's a two quarterback class. The second quarterback end up being Cam Ward and not Carson Beck. That's the only difference. Cam Ward emerged and Carson Beck
And
fell, so
and we
he took
said in
that
real
title.
time, we made a point that everyone's like, oh, there's going to be at least 3 because someone else comes out. And we were like, hey, people fall too. They don't always go up. And these guys are not cemented. I made the point. Caleb Williams and Drake May had regression years. If they weren't Caleb Williams and Drake May, they fall out of the first, but they were. They were cemented elite quarterbacks. But if they were back end first and then they had that type of regression, they fall out of the first, but they were cemented. None of these guys are cemented. If Shador had a season like Carson Beck had, he'd be out of the first. But Carson Beck had that season.
Yeah. So there, at the end of the day, we odds were right. If you're everything should be about probabilities. There's no absolutes in anything. But if you were looking at it with an objective lens, the probability going back to last April was you're looking at probably a 2 QB class. And we also said in real time, chances are those two QBs will probably grade out around where JJ McCarthy is grading out, around where Michael Penix Jr. is grading out. They're going to be in that same tier, which are, that's, by the way, those are typically the guys who are at the top of most classes. They come out, and most classes have guys like that at the top because they're
Mm-hmm.
good quarterbacks. They're just not like the Caleb Williams or the Trevor Lawrences. They're not those guys in terms of prospects. That doesn't mean they're not going to be great in the NFL. It just means that's how they grade out. So this was very predictable. We were lucky enough to be so freaking horrific that we had the number one pick locked up until yesterday, you know. But that wasn't by design. That wasn't Joe Shane's plan. You think Joe Shane's plan on draft day 2024 was we're going to be 2-15 and we're going to get these quarterbacks? No, he didn't have a plan. He thought that Daniel Jones was going to be fine. He thought Malik Neighbors was going to prove to everybody that he's a great talent evaluator. He thought that a position player was going to save a bad quarterback. Tell me when you hear the similarities. He thought that by taking a position player when he should have taken a quarterback in a strong quarterback class was going to come in and resurrect and save a failing quarterback that they already had on their roster. He refused to look reality in the eye for what faced this organization and said, I'm going to take a position player because he didn't use touched by the hands of God as his words, but he essentially did. That's what he did. He did exactly what Dave Gettleman did in 2018 when he took Saquon Barkley. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, you can't compare that. Running back is not the same as wide receiver. Really? Because that running back's about, he could win the MVP this year. A position player is a position player. The value of the best position player pales in comparison to the value of a quarterback that is good for your team. I'm not talking elite. I'm just talking a good quarterback, a Jared Goff, right? It's not even close in value. And he said, I don't need it. He did a Gettleman. He pulled it. He pulled the exact, I mean, traded when he didn't need to do this, traded assets to pay a gigantic contract to somebody else's defensive player, passes on quarterback to take a position player, has a shitty season again, and is now in a position like Dave Gettleman was in 2019, where he's going to have to panic and figure out a quarterback solution. And they had it. They were lucky. They had it. They were at pick one. And the two quarterbacks at the top of the class, I don't care if you guys like them or don't like them, they're good enough. They're good enough where if you could take them at pick one and try it, right? Give them a couple of
Mm-hmm.
years, see what happens. They're good enough.
This. Oh,
But think about. I just want to finish this thought, Domati.
yeah.
He has that locked up. What does he do? Does he does he secure the pick with 2 games left? Does he secure that pick? Does he put Malik Neighbors didn't practice the whole freaking week. He was hurt. Tyrone Tracy wasn't practicing most of the week. You don't play them. You don't play them.
And you lose
You
without Malik Neighbors.
Right. You don't win that game without Malik Neighbors. You don't play him. I don't care if Malik Neighbors upset he didn't get 1,000 yards. He'll be happy when he has a quarterback. Who gives a shit? Right.
Mm-hmm.
You don't play them in that game. You don't play Neighbors. You don't play Tracy. You don't play Burns, who's been playing hurt the whole year. Other teams have no problem doing this. The Cleveland Browns shut down Jameis Winston. They just shut him
Mm-hmm.
down because they got their eyes on Price.
The Patriots might shut Drake May just because there's a chance he could get hurt in the final game.
Right. So this idiot has been given off ramp after off ramp after off ramp to fix his own buffoonery, and at every turn he does exactly what Dave Gettleman would have done. This man is no better than Dave Gettleman. He's an embarrassment. He fits right in with John Mara and Tim McDonald and these guys. I mean, maybe I shouldn't lump Tim McDonald in, but he fits right in with those guys. And he's doing the same thing. We're gonna go through the same playbook. If Joe Shane is retained as GM, which is it sounds like he very well might be, and the Giants are drafting fourth or whatever outside of the top two or three, you can bet that he's going to say, I got to trade up to get to one. I need a quarterback now. And all those process questions and, oh, you have to have this bar all out the window. None of it will matter.
Yeah, man, it's something they need to do, because if you don't move on from Joe Shane at this point, you have a desperate GM who's going to do whatever it takes to keep his job at this point. And we've gone over this so many times. Sean Mara has not learned his lesson if he does this. 2016, 2021, these years, the Giants went on spending spree after spending spree to either try to save their jobs, to try to give one last push to capitalize on their opportunity as GM. Jerry Reese did right before he got kicked out, and Dave Gettleman got it right before he kicked out. You are going to give Joe Shane this opportunity, and if you don't give him that opportunity to do that, you're a bad owner, for the record, because you got to give him the ability to do what he wants. Otherwise, why keep him? And then you're going to give him the ability to trade away the future, which, again, if you're not allowing him to do his job, you don't trust him to do his job, then you should fire him. So you should allow him to do it, and it is going to hurt this franchise tremendously if he gets it wrong. Tremendously if he gets it wrong. And you can't trust that his evaluation is being done in good faith, that he truly believes in these guys. And look, don't get me wrong, I think it'd take a swing. I mean, if you don't believe in him, you don't believe in him. But I question it after 5 QBs at this point that are going to go in the top 12 that I would wouldn't trust your evaluation if you didn't trust this guys. But that's where we would be, and you're just going to let him trade whatever it takes to get up there. It's a problem, man. I don't know how you can't see the foresight and have some foresight and see this. And hopefully Steve Tisch is somebody who can see this coming, because he stepped in last time and made a change. Hopefully he can do it. And I make that hope to Steve Tisch. And I'll say also about Steve Tisch, man, you promised us you're going to be more involved. That's what you said to us last time, and we haven't seen or heard of you since. If you don't want to be involved, then fine. Hand it off to somebody else. Hand it off to a Tisch that does want to be involved, because the Maras are ruining this organization, and we need another voice to tell them, not my voice, not Sal's voice. We need a voice. Our fans are trying. We're trying as a group. We're flying airplanes over the fucking stadium, like they did in the 1970s, trying to get it through the mayor's skull. The only person who can truly do this is you, Steve Tisch. So either do it, get involved, or hand it to somebody who will, because we need change. We need to start fresh, because this is the perfect time. There is no long-term contract. You are not attached to a quarterback whatsoever. Literally don't have a quarterback on the roster. You are not attached to a quarterback. You are a good shot financially. And if you want to make a move for a quarterback, they could if they feel that way, but they're not pressured to do that. It's truly if they only have the conviction, and you can trust that if you hire a new GM. And I hope that he pushes for that, and I hope that we continue to build off of what we did last time, where we had a title change for Chris Mara. We had Kevin Abrams wasn't even interviewed for the GM job. He was moved out of football operations. Chris Pettit was fired. There was a start. There was a glimmer that the Giants' old ways were starting to go away, but there are clear problems still. Like I said, if you think Tim McDonald is going to be the owner, and that's who's your successor, then move him to that side of the building. He doesn't need to be involved in football operations anymore. He's gotten plenty of experience over here. Get him prepared to be your successor. Chris Mara, you said yourself, just writes up reports for players and puts it into the system. If that's all he does, and at that point, all you got to do is take him out of that role to free yourself of this image that you have around the league that you are too involved and that there is an ownership problem in the front office, then do it because that exists. For the record, Jordan Raanan, he reported that Bill Belichick was warning people of the Giants' front office structure, and he basically said, if you want to know about it, go look at where Tim McDonald is and who he's related to. That's all you need to know. So it's time to move things around. It's time to officially heed the words of George Young. Get owners out of player personnel. Move them to wherever the fuck you want to move them, but get them out of the football side of things. And I would even one up you to one other thing out up there. If you need to get somebody to oversee this entire operation because you're not doing your job at this point, John Mara. You are too loyal to people. You have lost the vision for what it is to be a successful franchise. You need a middleman between you and the general manager. You need an overseer, a CEO of this football team to oversee these operations and fix this. It's a problem. You are going to continue to see airplanes over the stadium. You'll continue to be booed every single time you get a ceremony until you do the right thing. And this is how you do it. That's my pitch.
Yeah. I think we should close on how we would actually like to see them, other than Steve Tisch get involved, but and other than what you eloquently just put out, how we would, as fans who actually care about the future of this team, would like to see them proceed from this point forward to avoid the mistakes that happened from the time they benched Eli and then fired everybody and hired Gettleman to ruin everything, and then the Joe Shane era. But before we do that, I have been paying attention to the chat, um, and I got to let you guys know something. When we when Monty said let's do this episode, um, we did it obviously kind of impromptu today, and we appreciate all of you guys came. We have a good showing, and I appreciate that. Our goal was to not just provide a good dialogue for those of you who are our loyal listeners and those of you who interact with us, but we wanted to make sure that this got out to enough people in Giants land that that people listened to it and hopefully found it to be resourceful and helpful. We also wanted to make sure the Giants heard it, and I want to thank somebody new to our chat. Uh, Bangkok Baseball, clearly a member of the Giants brass somehow. Whether I don't know if you're Pat Hanlon or you're Justin Pugh, maybe looking for a job, or you're Carl Banks. I don't know who you are, but I want to thank you for being here because I think what you're doing is you're validating what we're doing, which is making sure that you guys hear what we're saying. Because if you're the only one in the chat fighting with your fans, you're fighting with the people who pay the salary of the players, the salary of the team. These are the people who pay for all of you, and you're arguing with them in the chat when all they're saying is we're tired of having no hope. So I want to thank you for being here because you're validating why we did this episode. So when you go back and report to the Giants what you heard today, you can tell them that you got cooked for an hour and a half in the chat by everybody who's tired of this bullshit, and that we just told the truth and we ignored it other than this little part right here. So please tell them, tell your friends, tell your friends. Let's talk about what we need to do going forward, Monty, because what we'd like to see as fans. And by the way, before we do that, the reason Giant fans are angry about the win yesterday and are not making or they're not taking victory laps and solace in a maybe good draft class. We'll have to, if draft classes take 2 to 3 years to assess, you got to give it a couple of years before you see how it shakes out. But it looks pretty good so far. The reason we're not doing that, the reason people are upset, because I see, the Patty Trainas of the world and Lawrence Tynes, the usual suspects, right? All the people, even Carl, who I have a lot of respect for, but these guys all saying, "Well, why are you upset?" We're not upset that they won a football game. We're upset that they lost 10 before that. We're upset that what you did is that you didn't win a thing that means anything. What you robbed your fan base of again was hope. What we're upset about is that we are hopeless as a fan base because you guys don't seem to understand that you're never getting off this hamster wheel of stupid until you actually make some meaningful changes. We were hoping you would be forced into it by having the number one overall pick. That's up in smoke. So let's talk about what they should do, Monty, because I'm not even thinking about quarterback anymore. Well, that's going to play itself out, right? That's going to play itself out at this point. To avoid the problems of the past as they move forward, I think you and I are pretty clear. The resume of Joe Shane and Brian Dable does not justify their continued employment with this team beyond the conclusion of the 2024 season. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So I think we would like to hear from Jay Glazer, on that Sunday morning that John Mara and Steve Tisch are leaning towards ending the tenure of Joe Shane and Brian Dable. If you really, and trust me, I speak for a lot of our fans, a lot of us want to see them both go. I would say most of us want to see them both go. The vast majority of us. There's a handful of you guys left who are holding on for dear life to what? But the resumes speak for themselves. We want to hear that they're gone, number one. Just those two for sure. They got to go. What comes next? And I've been an advocate for a guy like Brandon Brown. I have. I'm not gonna lie. I actually like his resume prior to joining the Giants. But I've now come around to this. And what I really think has to happen is what you've been saying. You can't fix this by building on a broken foundation. What's got to come next is like what Monty's saying. You hire a true executive to run this organization that puts up a firewall from ownership, a firewall from day-to-day interference from ownership. You can't block them out of everything, right? But you can't have them being involved in everything either.
You have a
Y-
middleman.
Right. Somebody who communicates with them, but that they're blocked out. It's not that John Mara has to say okay to every little thing Joe Shane does, and he just says it okay. He says okay. No, he shouldn't have to be involved in this. There should be an executive in charge of running the operations of this team who has the carte blanche to walk in and say, I may retain you, but I'm getting rid of you. And I don't care what ownership thinks. We need to fix this thing from the ground up. So I want to see somebody just like you to come in the middle and actually tear this up. And I'm talking all of it. I'm not saying you have to fire every scout, but the infrastructure and the way they work, their operations have to absolutely change. They have to change the way they do business, and somebody else has to come in from the outside and look at their operations and make them efficient, make them modernized, make them functional compared to the rest of the league. If that means you keep a lot of the people, that's fine. Just figure out how their workflow should be. But somebody else has to come and make these decisions. It cannot be I'm coming in to interview with Chris Mara, John Mara, Tim McDonald. They're going to sit in the room with me every day of my life. That can't be the structure going forward. If they go down that road again, we're going to be right back here in 2 to 3 years having the exact same conversation.
You need your Ozzie Newsome. You need your Ozzie Newsome to your organization who oversees the entire front office. Who, if your GM says, should we run this by Joe, or be like, you're good, you're not good, or you're good, I will take the heat on that. You do what you need to do. This is what's right for the organization. You need a true CEO. You need a leader of this organization. What you don't need, and I'm not telling John Mara to not be involved and not to be updated with football operations, but what you don't need is John Mara in the GM's ear every single day. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? You need a guy to separate the GM so he can do his job and he can work with a football CEO who can handle that stuff, and he can keep his job, can keep John Mara involved and help the GM do his job. That's what you need. You need a guy who's been in football for a long time. And at this point, you had back in the 1970s, the last time you had fans flying airplanes over the stadium. You had maras who were way too involved, and after that, when they hired George Young, is when they finally stepped out of football operations. I know to a different level than we're asking them to step out right now, but it needs to happen. There's been too much losing. Look, nobody cared that Chris Mara was in the front office and was leaving the draft early to go see his horse race in Kentucky Derby, despite being the director of player personnel. That's a true story, by the way, folks. Left day 3 of the draft while he's supposed to be in the draft. Regardless, people let you get away with that and get away with nepotism because we were a winning football team. You can't get away with this type of stuff when you lose. You need a change, and the more and more changes that happen, and it's still an issue, it's eventually going to get pointed at ownership, and they need to realize that. And if you don't want to be locked out completely, if you don't want fans demanding you to sell this team, this is the next step to make. This is how you can show you care. Is you can take a step back, understand that something is not working with how you're running this football team. Have some humility, accept that you are a part of the problem, and that's okay because you want to be a part of the solution. And that's what makes you a good owner if you're willing to do that. Robert Kraft is very involved. Robert Kraft cares a lot. He's found a guy in Bill Belichick who he trusted to run his organization. Step back and let Bill Belichick run the whole thing because he had the humility to find a guy who he trusted and hand it off to him. Yes, Robert Kraft has stepped in when he really thinks it matters. And I'm not telling John Mara not to step in once every 10 years when there's something big like trying to move on from the greatest quarterback of all time or trying to pass on a guy that people are view as a generational quarterback. Look, no one faults Robert Kraft for doing that because what on the day-to-day stuff, day-to-day decisions, he handed it off. So that's where this needs to go. We need to, as fans, push for this because the fans deserve better. I know so many fans who are season ticket owners who are seriously considering giving up their season tickets. And it's sad. I know people who have season tickets that have been in their family since their grandfather, people who have season tickets left for them in their father's will, people who got ripped off by this PSL scheme that the Maras came up with, who feel like they can't get rid of their tickets, who are this close, and maybe keeping Joe Shane will be their 11th reason why, and they will get rid of those season tickets. And I don't want them to have to do that. I want to see them be getting a huge discount by being season ticket owners. And I have to pay twice the amount to go to these games because I'm not a season ticket holder and they are. And that's what I want for my fellow season ticket holder fans.
If the Giants, if the NFL Owners Club was not a gigantic multi-billion dollar socialist organization, the Giants, let's be real, they would have been out of business and filed for bankruptcy for their failure a long time ago. It's the truth. No matter how bad you are in the NFL, no matter how poorly you run your team, and again, you look at the Giants' record the last 13 years, you almost have to try to be as bad as you are this consistently, right? The NFL parity, the inertia is to move you to the middle, no matter what you do. For you to be this bad, you're historically awful at what you do as an owner and the people you hire underneath you to run the team. If this was not a big socialist club where you got paid no matter what, you'd be out of business. And that's the
Mhm.
reality. This all you do as a family is the Giants, yet you would be out of business if the NFL wasn't a gigantic socialist club. And at some point, I mean, the NFL, the Shield, has to start looking at the disgrace that are New York football teams because they hold the name New York. They hold the name New York. They hold the biggest market in the country. They hold it hostage, and they're jokes. They're the two worst organizations in football. You don't think that's hurting the Shield? You don't think that's hurting the money of the owners, of all the owners? At
The
some
media,
point,
the media hub
yeah,
of the world.
right. At some point, I'd like to see Roger Goodell and the rest of the NFL owners step up and say, "What are you doing over there?
They did
What
it
are
once
you doing?"
before.
Yeah, it's getting to that point, right? And I kind of want it to happen again. Not saying force them to sell, although that would be kind of nice. But I'm saying step in and say, "You've made a damn fine mess of this again, and you're screwing up our business. You're screwing with our money. We're out here making international markets on Netflix and other things. You can't even get freaking New York right." Right?
It's
At some point, you got to step in, that's where the NFL is going to have to step in. And if these idiots, if they keep doing this shit and getting the same recycled results, if they keep Shane and Dable or Shane or Dable, if they just don't tear it apart, if they try to keep running it back and trying to put lipstick on this pig, at some point, the fans should just bypass John Mara and go directly to Roger Goodell and say, "Force these fuckers to sell. We've had enough, or we're just not going to patronize your New York team." It's getting to that point.
it's it. You know what? It's gonna come. If they don't get this right, it's gonna come. You're already seeing things that you did not see in 2021. Fans are more mad than they were in 2021, despite thinking us that we did things to start to move in the right direction. We modernized some things. We got rid of some problematic people, but we're seeing the same results, and that's the issue. Is we are still are doing the wrong things, and it's a shame because I don't think John Mara is Woody Johnson. Like, I think John Mara cares, and I think John Mara has a grasp of like understanding what a owner should and shouldn't do and where they should step in and where they shouldn't. I do think he grasps ideas of it, and I do think he truly cares as much as we do, more than we do, about this success, this team. But he has so much goddamn pride and so much goddamn loyalty that gets in his way of doing his job. He has loyalty to bad football people who've been around for too long. He has loyalty to family who have overstepped their self into football operations. And you have been warned by greats of your organization that they shouldn't be put in these positions, and they are now there, and you allowed them to get there. John Mara, I know he cares. I know he can. I know he is capable of making the right decision, but you have to do it, John. You have to put your goddamn pride away and put somebody in position who will do the right things for this football team, because I know you have too much loyalty to do this yourself. So put the person in and step back and enjoy a good football team.
I think that's a good place to close it. I don't know if you have any other thoughts here, Monty.
No, man, I think I basically touched on everything I wanted to touch to here. Um, you
We had a
know,
lot of
it,
viewers, and yeah, I want to thank them for being here.
yes, thank you everyone for being here. The only other thing I will say is me and Sal, we don't have a large podcast. We'll see how far this gets out to, because, you know, Bears don't like when people talk about their nepotism. I know the writer of the autopsy, again, we'll put that in scripture, Ty Don. I had him on when I used to do Big Blue Beards. We had him on our podcast, and he told us a story about how he got a message on New Year's on LinkedIn from Chris Mara, basically cussing him out for writing those articles. So
So sensitive.
yeah, they're not a fans of this, and that's where the one thing I was like, we might be able to get their attention if we bring up their nepotism into this. But regardless if this gets to them, I wanted to get to the fans because again, we're not a huge podcast, but us as people fans can start a narrative. I've seen how this thing spirals on Twitter. We're doing this on a Monday night. Tuesday, let's talk about this. Let's push this nepotism. Let's push that Joe Shane and Brian Dable be fired. Wednesday, Thursday. Hopefully, the Big Blue Banters, the Talking Giants of the world, all of them pick it up, and us together as fans, just like we did in 2021, can push the Giants to do the correct thing. And let's see how far we can get this thing, man. Let's see if we can get this past Brian Dable and Joe Shane. Let's see if we can get some changes in this ownership group. I don't know how far they're willing to go, but we need change, and every chance that we get a push for this change, we got to do it.
You closed it out nicely. Again, thank you guys for being here as always. Before we close it out, please, if you haven't hit the like button, hit like, subscribe, help us get our viewership up if possible. Tell your friends, send out the tweets. We appreciate all of you guys for being here. You can reach us. You can reach us at He's a Giant Pod on Twitter. You can reach me at Queens_guy. You can reach Monty at MONTECRI5TO. We are going to finish up our review of position groups in the next 2 weeks. We have wide receiver and we have safety left. So we're going to try to knock those out for you guys so we can get to the business of the Giants offseason, which is coming quickly. We may have to double up on that one quickly to get those out of the way because we have bigger fish to fry, but we will absolutely get that done for you guys quickly. If you need to reach out to us, please do. Again, like, subscribe. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the Giants, whoever you are, for being here. You're the reason we did this. So thank you for being here. Tell your friends about it and let John Mara know. And if you want to find me on LinkedIn, there's a weirdo on Twitter who looks up my personal shit, so you can find him. And he might be able to tell you what my professional name is, and he can send me a message on LinkedIn or to Monty. So go ahead and let us know on LinkedIn. We're gonna happily accept your hate mail on LinkedIn. Everybody else, let's give these guys hell and let's get this team fixed. You guys have a good night. We'll see you next week.
Fire Joe Shane.
Fire Joe Shane.